like how it should work, but it was also an agency that was destined never to fulfill the normalizing mission of modern state. That is, the normalizing mission as in to create the citizen subject and give them the power of self-actualization, of self-determination, because the premise of its power was the rule of colonial difference, namely the preservation of the alienness of the ruling group, the racial divide, which also sort of structured the larger administrative divides or biases, or political divides and biases, economic divides and biases, needed to be preserved in the colonial context in order for colonial governments to function. And therefore, governmentality as it worked in the West in relation to the citizen subject was not functional in the colonial context. Now, once we know what this idea of self-determination and colonial governmentality means and the paradox that it posits, we can move on to how Chatterjee sort of defines this evolution of social institutions and practices in the colonial context, and how he sort of writes or envisages or thinks of the history of the nationalist movement in India, how it could have evolved, or rather how he sort of builds the story of the evolution of the nationalist ethos or the ideas in case of the Indian national movement. And to do that, because we talked about social institutions that imagines a nation state into being for its communities, the social institutions and practices in the context of Bengal in Chatterjee's writing has been divided into these two categories, that of the material and that of the spiritual. Now, this is the divide that he kind of builds his thesis on about how nationalism created itself as this sort of sacrosanct sovereign territory outside of the intervention of colonial state. And we'll come to that. So first, what is the material domain? The material is the domain of the outside of economy, the outside. So material is that space of the outside, which is in society, of economy, of statecraft, science, technology, areas where the European countries had subjugated non-European people, and the colonized people must learn and incorporate these superior techniques to overthrow the colonizer. So it talks about technologies of infrastructure, for example. It talks about statecraft and state technologies of statecraft, such as government, law, courts, etc. It talks about science and technology. So it talks about, all the education also, for example. It does not only science and technology in terms of actual applicable science, but also in terms of philosophy, in terms of the ideas of democracy, of nation state, of civilization, etc. All these are the area of the outside of the material domain, where the difference between the colonizer and the colonized had to be decreased. The difference had to be eradicated. The non-European people of India or of other colonial countries, if it's applicable to other colonial countries of Africa, for example, had to catch up and ultimately overthrow, supersede the colonizer in order to sort of emerge as determiners of their own fate. Whereas the spiritual domain is a domain which is the inner domain, bearing the essential marks of cultural identity. In this domain, the East is superior. Okay, and this is how the national movement defined this area of exclusion from the colonial structure of rule, which was essentially Indian, which was essentially which bore the essential marks of cultural identity of its people. It's a domain of where the East is superior in the sense that it does not require the intervention of the state or does not require to catch up with the ideas of sort of the cultural ideas of the Western civilization. It prides itself on its own essential characteristics. So nationalism is the domain of the spiritual as its sovereign territory and resists any form of colonial intervention. It is here that nationalism launches its most powerful, creative, historically significant project to fashion a modern national culture that is nevertheless not Western. So here, the principal idea of difference between the material and the spiritual sides of social institutions and practices is that whereas in the material, the difference between the colonial colonizer and the colonized has to be sort of eradicated. The colonized people have to catch up to the progress, quote unquote, development, quote unquote, of that is sort of demonstrated by the colonial power, because of which the non-European people have been subjugated. The difference there has to be less and eradicated. Whereas in the spiritual domain, the difference has to be preserved. The difference between the colonizer and the colonized has to be preserved in order for national culture to come into being, in order for a modern national culture to evolve, which does not have which does not have a direct intervention from the colonial power. So it's something that is evolving off and from and for the national people of the post-colonial nation state, of the future post-colonial nation state. And I have also written the words bahir and male and ghar and female under the two categories, and we'll come back to that. But this is where the structure develops, where we have an outer domain of the material society world and the spiritual domain, which is the inner domain. The outer, of course, when you combine it with the spatial understanding of everyday lived reality, it's that of the outside of the world, outside of the house, the world, so as to say, the bahir, whereas the spiritual is that of the inner world, of the ghar, of the domestic and of the private, and it's of course synonymous with the female, and the bahir and the outside with the male. And we'll come back to this when we talk about the woman question. So when we start with the woman question, the question of the new woman and how this concept was imagined. So there are three questions that we will be talking about in the course of this discussion. The first one is, how does the woman question fit in with the claims of nationalism? Because ultimately this is sort of programmed or understood and imagined as this the struggle for independence, where the woman question kind of figures as one of the essential contributions to the development of the concept of nationalism in Bengal. And the second one is, did nationalism find answers to the new social and cultural problems concerning the position of women in modern society? So there was, of course, an unprecedented level of change, right, that was thrust upon the non-European populations with the advent of colonialism, with the bringing in of ideas of modernity, of urbanity, of political philosophical ideas, systems of rule that were thrust upon them, or rather they had to adapt to in order to function within the context of colonial rule. And how did the how did this growing or this idea of how did this change that affected women and the position of women in indigenous societies, how did nationalism contribute to solving some of the conflicts that emerged out of this sort of conflict between the traditional and the more Western modes of living within the colonial society? And the third one is, why is there a relative unimportance of women question in the legal and structural claims of nationalist movement towards the last decades of the 19th century and the 20th century as well? So why do we not see for example, a suffragette movement or a movement for women's rights to vote, or rights to property, rights, equal pay, or equal rights to jobs in the early 20th century, 1930s and 40s? There is no such equivalent to movements that had happened in the West, in the Americas or the UK, for example. And in fact, there are graduates from the Calcutta University that Partha Chatterjee cites in his book, who were allowed to go into the university system, take exams, join occupations, even before women were allowed to sort of register their names on examination rolls in Western universities, in universities in the UK. So why is there this very strange sort of difference between how the woman question and the role and the rights of women sort of evolved differently in the post-colonial context than in the context of the West, from where the ideas of nation and gender and all that was derived and being adapted from? So these are the three main points that we will be talking about. And to begin with, this is based, why is the woman question coming into discussion. Okay, why is it even relevant to talk about the women question in the context of nationalism, in the context of finding a nation state, a format of a nation state, a theoretical format, a theoretical structure of a nation state, a framework of thought for the nation state? That why is it important to talk about the women question within that framework? So here is a sort of a snapshot of the reasons that he provides. And the first one, of course, is the idea of the civilizing mission. So alongside instituting orderly, lawful, rational procedures of governance, colonialism also saw itself as performing a civilizing mission. The central element of the ideological justification of British colonial rule was the criticism of degenerate and barbaric social customs of the Indian people, sanctioned, or so it was believed, by the religious tradition. By assuming a position of sympathy with the unfree and oppressed womanhood of India, the colonial mind was able to transform this figure of the Indian woman into a sign of inherently oppressive and unfree nature of the entire cultural tradition of a country. The underlying assumption is again a homogenizing one. The colonialist discourse, by assuming the hegemony of Brahmanical religious texts and complete submission of all Hindus to those texts, defined the tradition that was to be reformed and criticized. So what Partha Chatterjee suggests here is that it was necessary, or in a way it was easy and useful for the colonizing mission to imagine, to conflate the ideas of backwardness, of degenerate barbaric social customs, with the idea of the unfree, oppressed womanhood of India, in order to bring in the discourse of reform and civilization and development into the discussion of the colonial regime, and implement that as well, implement change in the colonial context. But what is problematic with this assumption is that it's a homogenizing one. It's a very generalized one, because it is taking into account, or taking for granted that it was the hegemony of Brahmanical religious texts that had, sort of structured the entire society, and that was influencing all social institutions, practices within the society, which is not the case, because India, of course, was extremely diverse in its religious propensities and, in its communitarian practices and really regional diversities. So this is a convenient assumption that allows for reform and development and these discourses to proliferate within the colonial politics of that time. And this is, therefore, the woman question then becomes a question that had been constructed by the colonial powers, or the colonial power, in order to implement reform change within the colonial context, and was picked up from there by the nationalist elite, the middle class intelligentsia of the late 18th or mid-18th century, mid-19th century, to be a sort of a place where reform was needed, where traditional ideas of understanding the role of women within the house and outside it had to be reformed, had to be addressed. But going back to the structure that we were talking about the spiritual domain and the material domain, it was something that had to be done. The reform of the reform of the gender roles of women within the indigenous or the non-European communities had to be reformed, had to be changed, updated, without the intervention, the direct intervention of the colonial state. That is, without intervention of actual lawmaking. That was again a feature of the courts of the colonial government, without proper, the exact administrative measures to do so. For example, the eradication of the sati, or for example, the Child Marriage Act or Child Remarriage, sort of Widow Remarriage Act, etc. So these were the early examples of reform, where early nationalist thinkers sought the help of the colonial government in order to implement reforms in the case of reviving or sort of restructuring the role of women within the society. But later nationalists, as the period between Ram Mohan and Bhattacharya, that is when nationalist thought actually was trying to sort of format itself as a cultural and identity politics. And that is when the divorce between the earlier ways of sort of seeking reform and the nationalist way of understanding reform happened. That is where the nationalist thinkers thought of the sphere of the domestic, of the home, of the woman question as something that is essential to national culture, and that has to be solved by inputs from a very indigenous community and without any direct involvement of the colonial ruler. So it was something that was sacrosanct, something that was closed off from the influence of the Western rational thought or post-Enlightenment sort of frameworks of reform and development. So what emerged from this sort of understanding or this sort of planning of separating the woman question from the domain of the public and outer and the statecraft, etc., was to make home, the space of the domestic, the space of the home, the strategic sort of terrain for understanding or reviving or updating and redefining the role of the woman in the nationalist politics of the state, of the post-colonial state. And the domain of the family and the home, as obviously, underwent a huge change in the world of nationalist middle class. It was undoubtedly a new patriarchy that was brought into existence, different from the Western family, sort of family structure. The new woman was to be modern, but she would also have to display the signs of national tradition, and therefore would be essentially different from the Western woman. So there were several categories of difference that were sort of identifying what the new woman was to be like, in the sense that she was different from the understanding of the common woman, for example, who was coarse, vulgar, loud, quarrelsome, devoid of superior moral sense, sexually promiscuous, subject to brutal physical oppression by males. And there was also, on the other hand, the idea of the westernized woman of the wealthy parvenu family spawned by the colonial connection, as well as the common woman of the lower classes. So this new woman was a concept that was different from the lower middle class women who were working in the urban metropolitan scenario as house help, as lower class occupational sort of categories, but also was different from the westernized women of the parvenu or the business class, which had sort of gained wealth due to their association with the colonial economic sort of structures. So this woman had to, the attainment, this particular, and these are the three sort of general summary of what the new woman has been defined as. And education was meant to inculcate in women the virtues, typically bourgeois virtues, characteristic of the new social form of disciplining, of orderliness, thrift, cleanliness, and a personal sense of responsibility. The practical skills of literacy, accounting, hygiene, and ability to run the household according to the new physical and economic conditions set by the outside world. Once the essential femininity of woman was fixed in terms of certain culturally visible spiritual qualities, and that also implies the way they dress, the way they talk, the way they participate in social practices, both inside and outside the house. They could go to schools, travel in public conveyances, watch public entertainment programs, and in time even take up employment outside the home. But the spiritual signs of her femininity were now clearly marked in her dress, eating habits, her social demeanor, her religiosity, and these were the boundaries that she could not transgress. So the way of understanding the position of women in society, therefore, changes from its physical conception of place of inside and outside the home to a more sort of spiritual understanding of the role of women and the new woman in society. And education, in this sense, kind of conflates the idea of is the means by which this new woman is to attain by her own efforts a superior national culture, which was the mark of the woman's newly acquired freedom. And this was a central ideological strength of the nationalist resolution of the women's question, to sort of conflate the idea of self-actualization and self-attainment of the new woman with the idea of the attainment and actualization of the nation state. So by conflating the two, the new woman then becomes a sort of this concept then contributes to the idea of constructing a definite, distinct national culture, which was different from the Western understanding of nation state and modernity, etc. So it then allows for exemplification, an example of how the nation state was defining itself, or the idea of the post-colonial nation state was distinct and different from that of the Western idea of nation state that it was adapting from. It was a selective adaptation, sort of a pick and choose of of qualities or of ideas that one could incorporate within the nationalist understanding of modernity of nation state, which was then to become the post-colonial state. So that is how the woman question develops. But before I go into further, like a sort of criticisms, can I know how much more time do I have? Hello?
You can continue. It's 5:40, so
okay.
10 minutes, 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So what emerges from this understanding of the new woman is that it is, as you can see, it is based on a very select sort of middle-class Bengali intelligentsia who have developed their own sort of understanding of a modern, they have contributed to many social institutions. For example, this particular strand, it's a very limited understanding of how the woman question is resolved within the larger nationalist question, because it sort of pertains to a very select social community, right? A very select social sort of category, that of the Bengali middle class intelligentsia. But we also have, sort of the modern Bengali language as an example of how all these categories of woman, of language, of literature, these social institutions through which the nation was being imagined, kind of worked with each other, how they were all reformed in a way, or sort of rethought in a way where they were complementary to each other. For example, this idea of the new woman as it comes into vogue is best understood through how the idea of education and educating women kind of worked hand in hand with the understanding of new woman as someone who's distinct from a westernized woman, or someone who's distinct from an indigenized, earlier patriarchal system, a woman from a previous generation. So a very distinct category from these. And this is because the early efforts of introducing education to women were mostly done by Christian missionaries or state-sponsored schools teaching English, of course, in the medium of English. And this was, of course, looked at with suspicion as propagating ideas that would be maybe Christian or maybe challenging and demeaning the nationalist, or rather the more indigenous forms of thought, tradition, language, value system. And this was solved by developing the mother tongue, that is of Bengali, into a modern language, a language that would serve the needs of the modern world and state, equipping the language with devices that would enable it to do so. And then creating this entire chain of dissemination of that language through print, again, taking Anderson's term of print capitalism, through printing presses, through publication of literature in this particular language, and dissemination of that literature, not only as sort of books to be read, like a sort of recreational literature, but also through schools and educative literature, teaching materials in Bengali language, which were circulated through this network of secondary schools that were being funded by this middle class intelligentsia of Bengal across the whole state, or across the whole presidency, where schools were set up and this particular curriculum was being taught, which was constituted of the literature and taught in the language that was being sort of generalized and standardized as the language of the modern world nation state, or that of the modern world language of Bengali community in general. So the long debates of the 19th century on a proper feminine curriculum now seem, somewhat quaint, because this new woman and the idea of English language in particular terms were not necessary, like in the sense that English language then, or a training in English language then, did not become essential to the new woman. The problem was resolved through the efforts of the intelligentsia, the middle-class Bengali intelligentsia, which made it a fundamental task of the national project to create a modern language and literature suitable for a widening readership that would include newly educated women. Through textbooks, periodicals, creative works, an important force that shaped the new literature of Bengal was the urge to make it accessible to women who could only read one language, their mother tongue. Okay. And this, again, contributed, or rather is related to how women then used education as a means of self-attainment, of actualization, and then also that fed into the idea of the self-actualization and attainment of the nation state, or the nationalist movement itself, the idea or concept of the Indian national movement, which was different, distinct from the understanding of the Western idea of national movement and nation state. But this whole analysis, so as to say, has several limitations. The first, of course, as I mentioned, is that it is limited to a particular social class, linguistic class, that of the Bengali middle class intelligentsia. And it is also limiting in terms of the location of the state in the nationalist resolution of the women's question, in the sense that it is leaving out several groups, politically distinct groups within the middle class intelligentsia, for example, that of the minorities. Okay, and Chatterjee does talk about Muslims as a community that kind of was outside of this conception of the new woman and how she was integrated within the nationalist politics of reform or development, or the understanding of nationalist politics as distinct from that of the Western idea of emancipation or modernization, etc. So that is a major problem with this construct, or this understanding and this version of history of the role of women and how it was understood within the nationalist politics. So he concludes the chapter saying that my analysis of the nationalist construction of women once again shows how, in the confrontation between colonialist and nationalist discourses, the dichotomies of spiritual material, home world, feminine masculine, were enabling the production of a nationalist discourse which is different from what that of colonialism, nonetheless remains trapped within its framework of false essentialisms. And this understanding of a very essentialist sort of understanding of community, a very culturally marked, defined understanding of community, which does not allow for the heterogeneity of the society that it was catering to, again brings us back to the initial question that we were talking about, which Partha Chatterjee defines as postcolonial misery. And that is the, that the autonomous forms of imagination of the community that was distinctly different from the Western, that is, communities of postcolonial or colonial nations, when they were imagining their national state or their nation state, their community, there was no room for imagination or imagining a modern society, a modern community, or a modern state that would not fall back into the ideology of the modern liberal democratic state, because that is the framework which we kind of borrowed and perpetuated in the postcolonial nation state format. So in a sense that even though the early period of nationalist thought in its approach to women, in its approach to literature, culture, did endeavor to define itself as distinct from the Western constructs of, Western idea of modernization, of emancipation, civilization, of gender, equality, etc. It fell back, all these debates fell back because we then went ahead and kind of adapted the same liberal democratic understanding of state and perpetuated that in the postcolonial nation state format. So in conclusion, if the woman question has its origins fixed into the difference from Western conception of gender in modernity, and even though it has so even though in the early period, in this period that we were discussing, and the period from which these examples are drawn, and from which this thesis is sort of propounded by Chatterjee, that the understanding of new woman in the Indian nationalist context is distinct and different from that of the Western woman, it is only applicable until the postcolonial state comes into its own. That is when the idea of the woman question then gets again incorporated in the domain of the public, of the political. That is, we talk about laws regarding women's representation, for example, court sort of representation of women in parliament. We talk about inheritance laws. We talk about, there are ways, or there are, because it now becomes the norm. So the women question then becomes a part of the public political debate as well. It is no longer relegated to the domain of the home and the domestic and the personal anymore. It is a part of the public, the outer material sort of domain, as well as the spiritual domain. that is what happens in the post-colonial nation state after independence, right? So that is what, but then the problem here, the problem that we sort of kind of carry with us from this earlier conception of the woman question is that how do we then step out of this, how do we think of new forms of community and develop a theoretical language beyond the Western rational post-Enlightenment model that will stay true to the local specificities of post-colonial political experience and gender, and the understanding of gender within that very specific post-colonial political context. If we are still going to sort of negotiate and tiptoe around the structure of thought, of the theoretical structure of a nation, of law, of courts, of the sort of various devices of statecraft, are still the ones that we have inherited and then perpetuated in the post-colonial state. So how do we get out of that? How do we... Sorry.
Arunima, just stop your presentation and start again. Really sorry about this.
Yeah, I'm just concluding last few lines.
Yeah, but your presentation has been interrupted. If you don't want to show the slides, fine.
Huh. So what do I do?
You can stop presenting and start again.
Okay, resume presentation, right?
Hello?
Hello, yeah.
You can.
Okay. So I'm not sharing the slides anymore because I was going to conclude anyways. So the idea is, because we are, the woman question, as Chatterjee proposes in the early part of the nationalist movement, before it became a properly consolidated political struggle, defined the woman question as something that belonged to the domestic, the domain of the domestic, of the inner, of the spiritual, which was distinct and separated from that of the public, outer, material aspect. But in the post-colonial nation, of course, after we attained independence and again followed the concept of the liberal democratic state, this woman question then got incorporated within the public aspect of it as well. That is, we now have laws, rules, discussions about inheritance laws, about representation of women in panchayats, in political societies, etc. So now it is a part of the political, of the material, of the outside, as well as that of the inside, of the inner spiritual domain. But even then, the whole structure, the opportunity to sort of imagine a different sort of a modern community, a modern state that would allow for a different expression or different negotiation of the position of women within it. If we have to do that outside of the construct of the Western liberal democratic idea of a nation state, then that has still not been achieved. And the point here of this entire book or this discussion is whether we can think of ways where we can find a strategy or a theory which kind of allows us to imagine a community or imagine a nation state which is outside of and distinct and different from the liberal democratic state format that we are following in the post-colonial nation state, which is more specific to the topical realities of lived post-colonial experience as we do today. Instead of local negotiations, how about changing the, thinking of a format that changes the way we think of nation state in general, and the concept of nationalism within it, and the concept of how women contribute to that idea of nationalism within it. So yeah, thank you.
I thank you immensely, Dr. Bhattacharya, for your very enriching and intriguing talk. And I'm sure that all of us present today, it has been an extremely stimulating experience. So I will be taking you through the interactive session, the question answer session now. And I see that, in the chat box, there are quite a few questions waiting. So we'll take up some of them, shall we?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So the first question that I see, I can see here is, I'll just read out the question. Can you say that it is in the culturally marked differences that the ideas of alternative modernity could be found in the Indian nationalist context.
Okay, what is the first part of the question, sorry?
It says, can we say that it is in the culturally marked differences that the ideas of alternative modernity could be found in the Indian nationalist context?
Okay. So here, shall I answer this question, or would you like state a few more questions? And
tell me, I'll just do as you...
I can answer this question and then we can take...
We can pick up the next one. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So the point, if I am to talk about Chatterjee's idea of colonial modernity and the concept of alternative modernities, there is a there's a suggestion here where in this chapter, particularly the one that I'm dealing with, chapter 6 in the book, it talks about Western modernity as something that from which colonial modernity, or the nationalist idea of modernity, picks and chooses. That is, it sieves certain ideas, it adapts certain ideas. There is a category according to which these ideas are judged and then chosen and incorporated. So it's talking about a unitary understanding of modernity, from which nationalist modernity is kind of adapting and forming. So I'm not particularly sure if we can say that it's an alternative modernity. It is adapting. So therefore, the question that I asked in the first slide of whether this is a derivative concept or not. So when I'm saying that the idea of nationalist modernity is deriving certain aspects from the general understanding of Western modernity, it does not, I'm not implying that it is constructing a whole different understanding of modernity, which can be called alternative modernity, but rather a related concept, which is more attuned to the nationalist struggle and its agenda. And that is where cultural institutions come into play, in exemplifying, in sort of acting out, in sort of grounding those understandings of modernity in the Indian context, but not necessarily different, but distinct from.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question.
Yes.
It says, Partha Chatterjee in chapter 7, Women and the Nation, talks about the relatively lesser known women works in order to highlight the developing woman subjectivity. However, most of these works reflect that these women did agree to the dichotomy of Ghor Bahir formulated by the male nationalist discourse. Do we have women works in colonial times which challenge the division as well as the male nationalist discourse by locating themselves in the gap between Ghor and Bahir?
Yes. So you are very correct in saying this, that Chatterjee actually makes a point out of it, of saying that why the question is important in several pages of this chapter as to why the women of this period were keen on sort of identifying themselves with this concept of the new woman and sort of giving in and adapting this concept of new patriarchy as well, following it and identifying with it and sort of exemplifying, practicing it through their everyday social interactions, both inside and outside the house, right? And then the second chapter kind of takes up the Smriti Kathas, that is, he makes a particular division between how autobiographies and Smriti Kathas. So autobiographies of men, which kind of followed the pattern of hagiographies of Chaitanya Charit and the word Charit itself, opposed to the understanding of Smriti Katha, which is more like a social documentary and the placing of the individual subject within that changing social sort of suppressing the individual tonality or the individuality of the subject within a sort of a description of the changing social times. And that is where he positions the way a woman narrates her life and her subjectivity. Now, of course, that is the work of subaltern studies, right, in a way, to find out whether there are books and there are narratives which kind of position themselves in between this divide or question this very easy sort of transition from one form of patriarchy to another newer form of patriarchy. And of course, that I think some of the material that he has cited in the second chapter can also be read to against its grain to kind of open up these conversations, like the one that I was suggesting in the very beginning about Maitri Devi's book, for example. It is a good example of kind of, and there are so many other literary examples in this period where women are caught between the expectations that are, as I said, the very bourgeois virtue related expectations from them, and also the education that they have been given and the kind of expectations that come from that education. There must have been a clash, right? And there are the plots of so many novels sort of hinge on this difference between expectations that are forged on, influenced by education, and the realities of existing in society, and the invisible boundaries, the glass ceilings that they come across in sort of practicing those expectations or manifesting them. So yes.
Yeah. The third question for today is, don't you think that the material and the spiritual domains have started encroaching upon one another during the post-colonial times?
Yes. So there is a reason why they separated why he reads the national movement as something that very strategically separated the domains of the material outer world from the spiritual inner world, right? It is serving a very strategic purpose in creating a space for the national movement to evolve, or the national consciousness to evolve, which is outside the influence or beyond the influence of the colonial power. Now, in the post-colonial state, because we have adopted the liberal democratic format of the Western rational, nation state, there is no need of this divide anymore, right? Because we need to now, women also are part of the legal system. We are going to courts. We are participating in the debates of the, outside world, and there is representation, there is property laws, etc., etc. Like all the devices of statecraft apply, the gender question applies to them. So there is no need, no strategic need for this divide anymore. But what the problem still remains is that we are still caught up in the concept of the Western rational framework of thought of a nation state, of how gender functions within the construct of that nation state, and therefore not being able to make enough space for very local, specific problems of our own societies, which are maybe regionally diverse or geographically, linguistically diverse, etc. But there has to be space that has to be negotiated from this Western construct that we have adopted and adapted in the post-colonial state format. Yeah. So yes, of course, the divide doesn't exist. Yeah.
The last question for today, it says, can we presume that non-cooperation movement derived its power from a moral or spiritual strength as different from violent struggles which were more material or direct? There is an opinion that we might have achieved independence earlier through direct or violent struggles or movements.
Yeah, so there is now there are several chapters to this book, right? So there is this discussion on Gramsci's idea of resistance, that is the passive revolution, which is revolution plus restoration. So that is what Chatterjee builds on in his his way of thinking of transition from the colonial to the post-colonial state of the the nationalist struggle. So that is the sort of modus operandi of the national movement that he hinges on, that kind of brings together the concept of revolution with that of restoration. That is the Gramscian model of passive revolution. So yes, that is what Chatterjee thinks. Like, I'm not giving my opinion on whether extremist politics would have gained us independence faster earlier than it has happened, but sticking to the text and telling you what the other chapters tell you about this.
Yeah. Right. Thank you once again, Dr. Bhattacharya, for an excellent presentation and an enriching talk. I now hand over the platform to Professor Ruby Pal, Associate Professor, Department of Economics, Lady Brabourne College, for delivering the vote of thanks. Ruby.
Thank you, Mohua. It is really my proud privilege and honor to propose the vote of thanks in this two-day international webinar on post-colonialisms, women and current configurations. My heartfelt thanks and gratitude to the Honorable Speaker, Dr. Shaurik Bhattacharya, for his enlightening and enriching presentation on post-colonial studies, current configurations. All of us who attended your lecture yesterday were immensely benefited. Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya. Brilliant and thought-provoking presentation of women, nation and colonial modernity in Partha Chatterjee's The Nation and its Fragments, delivered by Dr. Arunima Bhattacharya, was really engrossing. We are so thankful to you, Dr. Bhattacharya. Our respected principal, Professor Shivli Sarkar, always motivates us to organize seminars. And amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, her encouragement and support motivated us to organize this webinar. We are so grateful to you, madam. Webinars need proper technical support, without which the entire program fails. We are really thankful to Mr. Arvind Prasad for providing us with this much needed technical support. In this connection, I must thank Dr. Deblina Roy, Assistant Professor, Department of Botany of this college, for coordinating between the organizers and the technical support provider. I take this opportunity to thank the Advanced Research Center for Indian Writing in English and the Women's Studies Center of Lady Brabourne College for organizing this two-day international webinar. Last but not the least, all the participants from all over India have made this effort a grand success. On behalf of the organizers, I thank each and every participant, including our dear students, for participating with full enthusiasm. Thank you all once again. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Pal and Dr. Roy. And thank you for inviting me to this talk. It was a really good experience.
Thank you very much.